Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Parenting Through the Parsha with Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
This has been the last full week of school for my kids this year. And so we've had the typical end of year ceremonies, celebrations, etc. And in each of them, in some way, shape, or form, there's been an acknowledgement of the ways in which this past year has been uniquely challenging. As a parent, as a Jew, as a person who's aware of what's happening in the world. With each of my kids, certainly with my third grader and with my seventh grader, there have been multiple moments over the past few months in which questions have come up about what's happening in Israel, in Gaza, what's happening in the United States, and trying to find ways to speak with them both in age-appropriate and honest ways about what's happening and their response to it and our response to it and how to navigate through that. And it's difficult. It's not easy to figure out how to do so without shying away from the truth of what's happening to the best of my and our understanding of it, while also recognizing that they're still kids. How do we do that? This week's Parsha has some very difficult stuff in it. It's a whole section called the Tochacha, the rebuke, in which the Israelites are told in graphic and disturbing terms what will happen if they don't do what they're supposed to do, what these curses will look like. I didn't necessarily want to go right to that section of the Parsha in a parenting podcast, but there are ways in which it seemed to make some sense to try to grapple with that. And I'll speak to a couple of different components of how we might think about that, but I'll start by naming, as I was looking around and trying to figure out what sense I might be able to make of a number of verses, a long section of the Parsha that is punitive and harsh and causal in a way that I don't think about how God works in the world. If you do X, you get Y. If you don't do X, you get Z. But I found this really interesting anecdote that picked up on this, the custom, how the section is usually read. It's usually read in essentially a whisper. If you're at Shul on Shabbat morning, it is likely that you will not hear these words read out loud in the same kind of way you would usually hear Torah chanted, but it'll be in a softer tone. And it's told that the Klausenberger Rebbe, Rabbi Ekuziel Yehuda Halberstam, who was a survivor, was in Shul on Shabbat morning, and he was in Shul for this reading of the Tochacha. The Torah reader was chanting it in the typical whisper, and he said, as the Torah was being chanted, he said, "Louder." And the Torah reader didn't know what to do. He continued reading as he had been reading. And once again, he banged on his podium, he banged on his lectern, and he said, "Louder, read it out loud, because we have nothing to fear. We've already experienced these curses." With this rabbi, a Holocaust survivor, we've already experienced these curses. So God should hear these curses and know that we've experienced these curses already. And so now it's time for God to send the blessings. It's a really fascinating way of thinking about how we navigate tragedy and hope and sorrow and blessing. We aren't in a similarly catastrophic historical situation, and we're in a really painful moment. And I think it's poignant to think about, instead of hiding from our kids, hiding from ourselves that pain, to be able to look at it honestly in age-appropriate ways, not to bombard our kids or ourselves with more trauma or graphic detail than they can handle. We need to be protective of ourselves as well. And I think there's something to this idea that we say, yes, the world can be a scary place. The world can be a painful place. That's true. And there can be hope, and there is hope, and there can be blessings, and there are blessings. And how do we navigate through that? With honesty, looking that in the eye as much as we can. Now, there's another challenging piece here as well in terms of that causal piece. God sends curses, God sends blessings. That's not my theology. That's not how I think about God in the world. And I think two pieces on that, one of which is to open ourselves up and our kids up to a sense that our understanding of God and how we think about God in the world can shift and grow. That at some point, this was a normative understanding of God in the world. For some people, that is their understanding of God in the world. What is God to you? What is God to me? How do I think why and how bad things happen in the world? Because that's also then an opportunity for conversation and connection. And I think another piece of that is if someone asks me, well, why do you think this happens? I might say, I don't know. I actually don't really know how it's possible that I can believe in a God of goodness and hope, and that such painful and terrible things happen. That's really hard to reconcile. And I still believe in a God of good and a God of hope. And what do you believe? And that's an opportunity to explore that in a, again, hopefully age-appropriate but honest way. The last piece I'll say is that though we have this long section of curses that we see in graphic detail, it's not the end of the Parsha, it's not the end of the book. This is Parsha Bechukotai, it's the last Parsha in the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus. And the last chapter focuses on what it took to maintain the sanctuary. Right? Very practical. What are we going to do to make sure that the space that we're creating together stays open, essentially? And I think there's something powerful to that as well. There were some blessings we heard about in chapter 26. There's a long set of curses that we hear about in chapter 26. That's not the end. What's at the concluding moment? How we create and maintain holy space together. And I think ultimately, wherever we are in our historical trajectory, but even and especially in times of challenge and tragedy and struggle, that's where we can take action. That's where we can and maybe even need to push ourselves to direct our energy. Yeah, we can grapple theologically. How could this have happened? Oh my gosh, what does it mean that this could happen in the world? And what am I going to do about it? I'm going to commit myself to building holy community. I'm going to see what I can do, what we can do to make sure that we are cultivating and sustaining holy space together. As I grapple, as I find the moments to say, here's what I think, as I have the moments of saying, I don't know. I know that there's something that I can do, and there's something that we can do to make sure we're connecting in building relationships. And that ultimately, when we say chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek at the end of each book of the Torah, we find strength together. We strengthen each other. And we do that by building community. That's something that each and every single one of us can do and should do. And we can look our kids in the eye and we can say, yeah, the world can be scary sometimes. And the world can be sad sometimes. And there's still holy work for each one of us to do. What's the work that you're going to do? Here's the work that I'm going to do. What's the holy work that we can and will continue to do together?
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.